Well, the votes are in, the polling machines are in storage, and the candidates are on their way to the next primary states. Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island get their shot in the spotlight next Tuesday. But will New York State's presidential primary have more than a passing impact on the 2016 campaign? And what did we learn about the national candidates and our fellow local voters during the 2 weeks when the Empire State was the epicenter of the race for the White House? We've gathered 3 Brooklyn journalists to talk about what they're seeing, hearing, and thinking. They are Zawadi Morris, the founder and editor of BK Reader. Good afternoon, Zawadi.
Good afternoon, Jared.
Mary Frost, the community editor at the Brooklyn Eagle. Welcome, Mary. And Ted Hamm, an associate professor and chair of journalism and new media studies at St. Joseph's College. Welcome back, Ted.
Thank you.
So last night, primary night, always exciting. I know a few of us were out actually doing reporting. A few others of us were sitting and watching from the couch. Mary, you were at Clinton HQ. What was that like?
Well, as everyone says, it was electric. The crowd was just going wild, and there was a lot of love in the house. There was a very strong feeling that, excuse me, Hillary was home, and all her friends were there. Cuomo was there, de Blasio was there, ex-mayor Dinkins was there, and it was just a love fest. It really was. There were indications of her future plans. She was reaching out to the Sanders camp, saying there's still a lot in common between us. Let's get together. And she also made a very strong pledge, a request for people to send money.
Yes.
Do a lot of fundraising. She said several times, don't forget, send $10, $5, just bring it on in. And there was a very sense of history. Many people said to me that they felt that they were attending something historic.
In the crowd, was there resentment of Bernie Sanders, appreciation, admiration? What was the sentiment?
No, I mean, it was pretty neutral. There were a lot of boos when the Republican names were mentioned, but there was actually applause when she said we have a lot in common. There was a feeling of family.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
And so, you were out at, or your reporters were out at polling places. What did that look like? Anything interesting?
I got a call and immediately started hearing that people were having trouble getting into the polls. One of the polls in Bedford-Stuyvesant wasn't open. She had another issue at a poll in Brownsville. So early on, there were problems with the polls not opening at the times they were supposed to open. And she said there was some confusion inside with the volunteers. And a lot of them seemed nervous. She said, nervous. If they didn't have an answer to something, they, just kind of panicked. But people were persistent, and eventually they got through it. But yeah, just a lot of nervousness.
Indications that citywide, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's talk about the results themselves. If we had said a month ago that Hillary Clinton was going to win New York big and Donald Trump was going to win New York big, it wouldn't have been that surprising, but it's being treated as momentous. Ted, what do you think is anything surprising about what we saw last night?
Well, I think many people thought Sanders might do a little bit better than he did. But if you look at the results, actually, Hillary got the same amount of, almost exactly the same amount of votes as she did in 2008. And so there's definitely a base of support for Hillary that just continues whenever she's running, right? But the other thing about the results is that the map is pretty much the same as the Teach Out versus Cuomo primary in 2014, in which Teach Out won many of the upstate counties, and then downstate, Cuomo crushed her. And that's pretty much what happened again this time around. So, I mean, I think one of the problems for Sanders was obviously that a lot of his voters are not registered Democrats. They're independents, Greens, what have you. The youth voters are just maybe haven't even registered yet. There wasn't a lot of information that was out in circulation.
Right, and does that account for this discrepancy between the huge crowds, the massive rallies, and then election day performance that really wasn't so much?
I would think so. I went to 3 or so of the rallies, and you could tell, and certainly the one in Greenpoint, we actually won Greenpoint, interestingly enough. But many of the people there seemed like there was a lot of Europeans and other sort of fans who had come on board, and you could tell that they weren't actually it wasn't going to produce a lot of voters. So the payoff for all the big events and his rallies and such didn't turn out at the ballot box.
So let's talk about the results and kind of what drove them. Among voters and neighbors in Brooklyn, and I guess we can start on the Democratic side. Mary, what do you think were the issues or arguments that won the day here when it came to Hillary Clinton prevailing in Brooklyn?
Well, when it came to Hillary versus Bernie, there were a lot of people still not decided until very close to the primary day. And in Brooklyn Heights, at the poll where I visited, some of the people who you would think would be very staunchly for Hillary did vote for Hillary, but they were sort of holding their noses when they voted. They said that Bernie had a lot of good points, but they felt a little unsafe with him. He almost reminded some of them of Trump, and so they went with the tried and true. And I think Hillary also did a lot of groundwork in New York and in Brooklyn. I mean, she reached out to churches. She has a history. So I think her history and her political acumen really paid off for her.
You're nodding. You hear similar things?
Yeah,
in your
I
stomping?
agree. I think the overall Clinton legacy in Brooklyn is pretty staid, and it couldn't be broken during this election cycle. But I think with the Bernie supporters, I think they were looking for a revolution, and I think the Clinton supporters really felt that he had a lot of great ideas. He was a great activist, but there weren't any real concrete plans. And so at the end of the day, just like you said, they were waffling. There was a lot of positives and negatives on both sides, but I think at the end of the day, the Clinton supporters felt more secure with their decision.
The media today is looking back on the past 2 weeks for Sanders and looking at things like the Daily News editorial board interview, the guns issue, which obviously plays very poorly here, perhaps more poorly here than anywhere else. Do you think those things mattered, or is this about we have Hillary voters and we have Bernie voters, and that's just the way it is?
That may have reinforced some of the voters that Mary's referring to that were sort of on the fence, and then the Daily News was presented as a failure for Bernie. Few people actually mentioned that the Hillary interview with the Daily News was the definition of softball, right? So it was clear that
there was a disparity there. Sure.
It was they were going in one direction. So yeah, I think there was people who saw that in the Clinton brand is just so powerful, particularly in I would say Black Brooklyn, and she won people of color, the vote of people of color by something like 75%. At least the exit polls would show that. But one of the things that never was asked, which was interesting to me, was that we talk about her 8 years in the Senate, and no one asked, like, what did you actually do in those 8 years? 4 of the years she was running for president, right, after John Kerry lost in 2004. So there was no actual policy achievement that they could point to. I mean, I'm not trying to reopen the debate, but it's just that sort of that brand was so powerful that people knew it and people stuck with it, I guess. Speaking
of a powerful brand, Donald Trump, one might think that New York being a relatively moderate state, that someone like Kasich would do better. What explains Trump's appeal to Republican voters in the borough of Brooklyn? What do you think is driving that?
I think it's the same appeal that on the opposite side that Bernie Sanders has had with a lot of the Democrats. I think people just want to turn over the system. There are some other things, of course, that go along with the Trump support, but I really think that there's a large segment of this population that is really ready to see a complete turnover of what's been happening in politics. And I think, in that way, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are actually cousins in their campaign. So same sort of rise up.
That might be an awkward family reunion to have awkward family reunions. But I looked quickly this morning at the turnout figures, and it indicated that on both sides, Republican, Democrat, about 33-34%. In 2008, 37% on the Democratic side. So turnout a little lower this time as a percentage of registered voters. There's been this idea that there's been an outpouring support for Trump, new people coming to the process, that Sanders and Clinton have energized people. Do the turnout numbers betray that idea?
Well, I think that same issue of the independents and Greens who are supporting Sanders is just they're just not simply registered Democrats. In 2008, obviously, the Obama campaign brought many more people to the polls, particularly in the black community and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think there's as far as Trump goes, I don't think there was there any one area of Brooklyn where he did really that well? I mean, maybe.
I think it was kind of a blanket as far as
sort
I know.
But a smattering of votes in different places.
Right.
Ted Cruz actually carried Borough Park. That was his #1 neighborhood because of his strong support for Israel.
They have very good New York values there. So,
and bagels and matzo and so on.
so what happens next? I mean, what was the sense in the Clinton crowd? Do they expect the primary race to go on for 7 more weeks? Do they think this is it?
Well, there was a very strong sense that this was a pivotal moment. I think what happened in Brooklyn and what happened in New York State, pivoted the whole thing now to a much stronger chance for just going straight ahead into the general election.
Your students, I think, probably a lot of them they probably skew toward the Sanders camp. What do they feel today, or what do you think they are thinking? Do they believe that it's time for us to kind of fold up and move on to the general election, or do they want him to keep up the good fight?
Well, I didn't see them today. I saw them yesterday, and they were excited. I mean, I think that's a bigger problem, right, for Hillary, is how do you motivate that young base to turn out, right, in the general election if the campaign stays the way it is, or the candidates stay the way it is. So that's going to be a challenge. I don't know. Probably her running mate would have a lot to do with that sort of outreach. Have to find someone who has a connection somehow. I don't know who that person is at this point, but that's probably important.
So Zawadi, New York had this moment in the sun. We were important for a couple weeks. But now that's kind of over, right? Because we're a solid blue state. Everyone knows how we're going to go in November. How do you think voters in Brooklyn might stay relevant, given the fact that the story is moving on elsewhere? What do you think the key to keeping voters in the state engaged is?
I think for a little while we're going to be talking about what happened at the polling sites. And I think people are going to be questioning whether or not Bernie's, I don't want to call it failure, but his performance wasn't as good as we expected. They're going to be questioning whether or not that has to do with the independent voters not having switched over their affiliations in time and not being able to vote, and the missing so many of the missing things that were happening at the polls. So I think that's going to be the conversation moving forward, even probably in some of the other counties and states that we see.
So let's talk about that. There's the issue that you mentioned about people not switching their registration, and that has to do with longstanding problems with New York's arcane voter rules. But then yesterday this thing popped up that the Board of Election had culled apparently like 100,000 names from the rolls, and we saw some problems at the polls. Any sense of what happened or why?
Especially in Brooklyn, and it was very shocking. I personally know 2 people who the names were called, and one of them is a resident of Bay Ridge, has voted for 40 years, the same place every time, and one is a college student who was informed via mail that apparently she registered in some other county in New York, which she didn't. So it seems random. It didn't seem like it was targeted to any one area. There were whole swaths of Brooklyn. 125,000 now they're thinking in Brooklyn. And Comptroller Stringer has started an investigation, and Bill de Blasio is supporting that. And the borough president, Eric Adams, is also getting involved in it. So.
And not the first thing to shake our confidence in the local board of elections, right? I mean, they're kind of a repeat offender.
Well, you think they would test out the machines the night beforehand instead of having the machines break down the day of the election, right? So there's a long track record of ineptitude. But if you read Nathan Tempe's article in The Gothamist, he describes going to the Board of Election and some of the chaos that he was told about and saw firsthand. And one of the events that he was discussed was on, I believe it was January 13th, they just basically cleared the rolls of several thousand of those names, for the most likely. So it seems more sort of random than targeted, but it's still, we have to see the results of the investigation to figure out whether what actually happened.
And we'll have ample opportunity over the next few months to see the Board of Elections perform again, because we have the federal congressional primaries in some districts in June. We have the state legislative primaries where that's relevant in September, and then the general election in November. The process we've seen in the state in terms of the performance yesterday, how the campaigns played out, if there was something you could fix to make democracy work better the next time New York is in the national spotlight, what might it be? What do you think it would be? I mean, you've mentioned the registration issues and how long before a vote you have to switch. Is that something you think we should tinker with?
Definitely. October 9th of last year, 2015, was the day that people needed to switch their affiliation, and that's 6 months ago. Over 6 months ago, actually. So Yeah, it would have been nice to have let people know that if, we already knew that the two candidates were Republican and Democrat. If they let people know you're going to switch over, you have to do it now. This is the deadline. I think that we're not as transparent as we need to be with the public about what they need to do to prepare themselves for these elections. We just focus on, did you register to vote? Did you register? So,
Ted, what would you tinker with?
Well, I think that's clearly the main issue. I mean, not very many people have discussed the fact that Bloomberg was actually pushing open primaries as mayor. And the problem was that Bloomberg didn't support public financing of elections, so people just saw that as he was trying to throw his money around and let people like himself dominate elections. But I mean, I think open primaries certainly should be considered, or at least some closer time frames up to in the run up to the election, when people are actually paying attention, that people can make that switch in the 30 days or so before, or maybe that could be the cutoff point. But that needs to be the discussion, right? So how do you get more people who are excited into the process rather than leaving them shut out?
Mary, anything on your list, if you could wave a wand?
And well, I just think more technical improvements, having online registration, having people be able to register when they get their driver's licenses, just making it more convenient for everybody.
So I don't know what you guys were doing last October 9th, but I hope after the upcoming primaries you'll clear space in your calendar to come back and discuss them. But thank you so much for coming today and talking about last night's exciting race.